This is Tony Victor, and I'm doing a reading from G.I. Gurdjieff's In Search of Being.
Self-remembering. It is impossible to remember oneself. This is because we want to live by mind alone. Yet the store of attention in the mind, like an electric charge of the battery, is very small, and other parts of us have no wish to remember. In our analogy of driver, horse, and carriage, our mind is the driver. The mind of ours wants to do something, to work differently from the way it worked before. It wants to remember itself. All the interests related to self-change, self-transformation, belong only to the driver. That is, are only mental. As regards to the feeling and body, these parts are not in the least interested in putting self-remembering into practice. The main thing, however, is to bring about a change not in the mind, but in the parts that are not interested. The mind can change quite easily, yet transformation is not achieved through the mind, if by the mind it is of no use. Therefore, we must teach and learn not by means of the mind, but through the feeling in the body. At the same time, the feeling and body have neither the language nor the understanding we possess. They understand neither Russian nor English. The horse does not understand the language of the driver, nor the carriage that of the horse. If the driver says in English, "Turn right," nothing will happen. The horse understands the language of the reins and will turn right only to obey the reins. Or another horse will turn without reins if you rub it in an accustomed place, as, for instance, donkeys in Persia are trained. The same with the carriage. It has its own structure. If the shafts turn right, the rear wheels go left. Then another movement, and the wheels go right. This is because the carriage only understands this kind of movement and reacts to it in its own way. So the driver should know the characteristics and weak sides of the carriage. Only then can he drive in the direction he wishes. But if he merely sits on his box and says in his own language, "Go right" or "Go left," the team will not budge, even if he shouts for a year. We are an exact replica of such a team. Mind alone cannot be called a man, just because a driver who sits in a bar cannot be called a driver who fulfills his function. Our mind is like a professional cabbie who sits in a bar or at a home and dreams that he is driving passengers to different places. Just as driving is not a real trip, so trying to work with the mind alone will lead nowhere. We will only become a spinner of theories and a kind of lunatic. The power of changing oneself lies not in the mind, but in the body and the feeling. Unfortunately, however, our body and our feeling are so constituted that they couldn't care less about anything so long as they are happy. They live only for the present moment, and their memory is short. The mind alone lives for tomorrow. Each part has its own virtue or merit. That of the mind is to look ahead. But it is only the other two that can do. Until now, the greater part of our desire and striving has been accidental, arising and existing only in the mind. In our mind there arose accidentally a wish to attain something, to change something, but this existed only in the mind, and nothing has changed yet. There is only this bare idea in the head, and each of us has remained as before. Even if we work 10 years with our mind, if we study day and night, remember ourselves in our mind, and struggle, we will achieve nothing useful or real. This is because in the mind there is nothing to change. What must change is the disposition of the horse. Desire must be in the horse, and ability, the capacity, in the carriage. When we say remember oneself, we mean ourselves. But we ourselves, our I, are our feeling, our body, and our sensation. We ourselves are not our mind, not our thinking. Our mind is merely a small part of us. To be sure, this part has a relation, a connection with ourselves, but only a small relation, so that very little material is allotted to it by our inner organization. If our body and feeling receive for their existence the necessary energy and various elements in the proportion of, say, 20 parts, our mind receives only one part. Our attention is a product of these elements of this material. Our separate parts each have their own attention. Its duration and power are proportionate to the material received. The part that receives more material has more attention. Since our mind is fed by less material, its attention, that is, its capacity to remember, is short and effective only so long as the material for it lasts. Indeed, if we wish and keep wishing to remember ourselves only with our mind, we shall be unable to remember ourselves longer than this material allows, no matter how much we may dream about it, or may wish for it, or whatever measures we may take. When this material is spent, our attention vanishes. It is exactly like an accumulator for lighting purposes. It will make a lamp burn so long as it is charged. But when the energy is spent, the lamp cannot give any light, even if it is in order and the wiring is in good repair. The light of the lamp is our capacity to remember. This should explain why we cannot remember ourselves longer. And indeed, we cannot, because this particular capacity is short and will always be short. It is so arranged. It is impossible to install a bigger accumulator or to fill it with greater amount of energy than it can hold. Nevertheless, it is possible to increase our self-remembering by bringing in other parts with their own accumulators and making them participate in the general work. If this is achieved, all our parts will lend a hand and mutually help one another in keeping the desired general light burning. Since we have confidence in our mind, and our mind has come to the conclusion that it is good and necessary for our other parts, we must do all we can to arouse their interest and convince them that desired achievement is useful and necessary for them too. We must admit that these other parts, the greater part of our total I, are not in the least interested in self-remembering. More than that, they do not even suspect the existence of this desire in their brother, the mind. We must therefore try to have them get to know this wish. If they feel impelled to work in this direction, half the work will have been done. We can begin teaching and helping them. Unfortunately, we cannot at once speak to them in an intelligible way because, owing to their neglected schooling, the horse and the carriage do not know any language fitting for an educated person. Their life and their thinking are instinctive, as in an animal, and so it is impossible to prove to them logically where their future profit lies, or to make them see their possibilities. Logic and common sense are not foreign to them, but they receive no education. Owing to this, these capacities have degenerated, and their own qualities have become dulled and atrophied. Nevertheless, thanks to their original nature, this condition is not irreversible. It is possible to restore them to their original form by destroying the results already crystallized of degenerated habits. Before starting new work, it is necessary to correct old sins. We wish to remember ourselves as long as possible, but we quickly forget the task we set ourselves because our mind has very few associations connected with it. Other associations engulf those connected with self-remembering. Our associations take place in our formatory apparatus owing to shocks that it receives from the centers. Each shock has associations of its own particular character, whose strengths depends on the material that produces them. If the thinking center produces associations of self-remembering, incoming associations of another character, which come from other parts and have nothing to do with self-remembering, absorb these desirable associations. Our problem is to bring our other parts to a point where our thinking center would be able to prolong the state of self-remembering as much as possible without exhausting the energy immediately. It should be pointed out that self-remembering, however full and whole, can be of two kinds, conscious or mechanical, remembering oneself consciously or remembering oneself by association. Mechanical, that is associative self-remembering, brings no essential profit, but is of tremendous value at the beginning in engaging the participation of all three centers artificially. In the case of our thoughts, this is done through conversations, lectures, and so on. For example, if nothing is said, nothing is evoked. We call it artificial because we were not born with these thoughts. They are not natural. They do not respond to an organic need. And if thoughts are artificial, then we can create in ourselves for this purpose sensations that are also artificial. The simplest, most accessible sensation can be gotten through uncomfortable postures. We can, for example, assume an unaccustomed position, sitting as we never sat before. For a time it is all right, but after a while we develop an ache. A strange, unaccustomed sensation starts in our legs. We have all the time an urge to shift about, to move our legs in order to change the uncomfortable position. But we have, for the present, undertaken the task to bear it, to keep our whole body in this position with nothing moving except our head. For the moment, we wish to forget about self-remembering, concentrating all our attention, all our thought, on not allowing ourselves automatically, unconsciously to change our position. Now, when an unpleasant sensation in the body, especially in certain places, has already resulted, we begin to think in our mind, I wish very much to be able to often recollect, in order to remember, that it is necessary to remember myself. I wish. You. It is me. It is my body. We say to our body, you, me. You are also me. I wish. These sensations that our body is now experiencing, and every similar sensation, we wish them to remind us. I wish to remember. I wish to remember often. All these sensations will remind us. At a particular moment, we come back to our wish to remember ourselves, and we remember by our mind. We ask ourselves, do I remember by sensation as well? As a matter of fact, we find that by sensation we do not remember ourselves. So we assume a particular position and pronounce these words. I wish to remember myself. When we pronounce the word I, we have a purely subjective sensation in the head, the chest, the back, according to the state we are in at the moment. We must not say I mechanically as a word, but must note in ourselves its resonance. This means that in saying I, we must listen carefully to the inner sensation and watch, so as never once to say the word I automatically, no matter how often we say it. The second word is wish. In pronouncing it, we sense with our whole body the vibration that occurs in us. To remember, every person, when he remembers, has a barely perceptible process in the middle of the chest. Myself. When we say myself, we mean the whole of ourselves. Usually when we say the word myself, we are accustomed to meaning either thought, feeling, or body. Now we must take the whole, the atmosphere, the body, and all that is in it. Each of the four elements by itself has its own nature and its own place of resonance. If all four were to resound in one and in the same place, it would never be possible for all to resound with the equal intensity. Our centers are like accumulators or batteries from which current flows for a certain time if a button is pressed. Then it stops, and the button has to be released to enable the battery to refill itself with electricity. But in our centers, which produce a resonance when we pronounce each of the four elements, the expenditure of energy is still quicker than in a battery. They must be given rest in turn if they are able to respond, like bells, each possessing its own battery. While we are saying I, one bell answers wish, another bell to remember, and a third bell myself, the general bell. It should be noted that each center has its own accumulator of energy. A feature common to us all is that the accumulators of our centers are refilled with energy only insofar as it is being spent, so that no energy remains in them beyond the amount being expended. At the same time, our machine has a general accumulator, independent of the accumulators belonging to the centers. The energy in this general accumulator is generated only when all accumulators work one after another in a certain definite combination. By this means, the general accumulator is charged. To this case, a general accumulator becomes an accumulator in the full sense of the word, for reserve energy is collected and stored there during the moments when certain energy is not being spent. Prolonging the memory of self-remembering is possible by making the energy in us last longer by drawing energy directly from the general accumulator. Although by itself, the thinking center can access only its smaller accumulator. A connection with the general accumulator can be effected through the feeling center. Our feeling is much keener and more subtle than our thinking, especially since its formatory apparatus is the only part that works. This explains why so many things are quite inaccessible to the thinking center. If we wish to know and understand more, we must keep in mind that this new knowledge and new understanding will come through feeling. Our aims must be to develop the activity of the feeling center. Thank you for listening. Please check out my project page on KundaliniQuicksilver.com. Click on the gray bar at the very top and it'll take you right there. Also, please go ahead and subscribe to my TikTok, Kundalini Quicksilver, also my Instagram and YouTube at Quicksilver Astrology. Thank you.